Welcome, quiet traveler. Tonight, we are stepping away from the noise of the modern world and moving toward a distant horizon. Imagine you are standing in the blue silence of a cold dawn on the edge of a great sea of grass. The only sound is the soft breathing of oxen and the occasional snap of a canvas cover in the morning wind. This is not a story of fast adventure or heroic deeds, but a slow journey into the lived reality of the past. Feel the ground beneath your feet, heavy with dew, and watch the first light catch the white curves of a wagon train. We are going west, one slow step at a time. Chapter 1. The wagon was not a home. This chapter serves to dismantle the romantic image of westward migration, introducing the physical and sensory reality of the covered wagon. We begin by stepping into the dim, cramped interior of a prairie schooner at the start of a long journey. The covered wagon standing before you in the dim light was never designed to be a home. It was a box of wooden planking, roughly 12 feet long and only 4 feet wide, propped up on iron-banded wheels that had never known the softness of a spring. From the outside, the white canvas bonnet looked like a promise of freedom, but from inside, it felt much closer to a moving coffin on wheels. The space was only 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall at its highest peak, requiring a man to hunch his shoulders and drop his chin just to stand inside. Every inch of this dark interior was packed with the heavy weight of survival, leaving almost no room for the people who claimed it as their world. Inside this cramped wooden frame, the air was always heavy, with a mixture of scents that no painting ever captures. There was the sharp mineral bite of axle grease mixed with tar, the lingering smell of salted bacon soaked into the sideboards, and the damp scent of wet wool hanging from the bentwood boughs. When the rain came sideways through the gaps between the canvas and the wood, the floor became a cold, slick surface of mud and flour dust. For 5 or 6 months, this was the entire world for a family of 9, a fragile shell aimed toward a destination 2,000 miles away that they chose to believe in because staying behind felt like a different kind of suffocation. We have spent over 150 years turning this experience into a bright national myth. We see it in golden paintings of pioneers moving into sunsets or in the pixelated memories of computer games from the 1980s and 1990s. In those games, the greatest tragedy was often a cheerful notification that you had died of dysentery, something that made the whole classroom laugh before the bell rang for lunch. But for the people who actually stood beside these wagons, there was no laughter in the dust. The reality lived in the narrow dark between the romantic image and the brutal fact, written in the fading ink of diaries and the heavy silence of the high plains. Between the year 1840 and the year 1870, somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 men, women, and children set out on this road. They loaded their entire lives into these freight haulers, vehicles barely the size of a modern pickup truck bed, and prepared to face a landscape more punishing than anything they had ever known. Most of them carried the misplaced hope that they would ride in comfort across the rolling hills, chasing a dream big enough to justify the suffering. They did not realize yet that they would not be riding at all, but walking instead, placing one foot in front of the other across a continent that was entirely indifferent to their survival. To walk 2,000 miles is to learn the physical language of the earth in a way that the modern mind can hardly grasp. Most migrants walked because their wagons were too heavy with flour and bacon, too stressed by the deep ruts of the trail, and too valuable to risk exhausting the oxen. They walked through shoes that wore thin on the rocky ridges, and soaked through, in the brown water of river crossings. They walked until their feet developed calluses that turned into open wounds, and still they kept moving. The wagon was their lifeline fiend, a heavy machine that required constant negotiation with the mud of Nebraska and the bitter alkali dust of the Wyoming desert. In the first weeks, the landscape of Kansas and Nebraska felt enormous, a sea of tall grass where the sky seemed to touch the earth in every direction. The miles accumulated slowly, perhaps 15 on a good day, as the iron wheels ground over ruts left by those who had gone before. Experienced men went quiet. When the distance between water sources began to stretch, calculating the strength of their teams against the rising heat, the wagon interior rumbled constantly, transmitting every rock and root directly into the bones of anyone attempting to rest inside. There was no suspension to soften the blow, only the rhythmic groan of wooden joints and the relentless clatter of iron on hard ground. As the trail moved further west, the names of those who had failed began to appear in the campfire conversations like a shadowed warning. The Donner Party was not a distant historical mystery to these migrants, but a recent memory shared from wagon to wagon like a heavy prayer. They knew the cost of delay and the weight of a wrong decision in the high mountain passes. In the dark intervals between the flickering fires, they spoke of October snows that could turn a passable grade into an impossible wall of white. Every father, closing a guidebook by the light of a single candle, felt the pressure of time pressing against the back of his neck, knowing the window for arrival was narrowing. The road was marked not only by ruts but by graves that weathered back into the earth long before the grass returned in the spring. Thousands of children were left along the trail, mostly taken by cholera, a disease that swept through the wagon trains with a speed that felt like a divine judgment. Parents wrapped their small children in whatever cloth they could spare, digging shallow graves into the hard ground before the morning sun forced the wagons to move again. To stop was to die, and to die was to risk the survival of everyone left behind. The silence of the plains swallowed these griefs, leaving only a rough-carved stone or a broken board to mark where a life had ended. To understand what it was truly like to live inside one of those wagons, we must look past the golden vistas of film and the simple stories of schoolbooks. We must feel the weight of the cargo, smell the axle tar, and listen to the sound of a child coughing under a damp canvas bonnet in the dead of night. This is the story of specific people facing specific problems in a world that offered them no safety beyond their own cooperation. The wagon was a prison, a home, and a lifeline all at once, carrying the weight of a million unseen hopes across a landscape that no one could fully imagine. It is time to look inside the wooden box and see the life that was lived there. We begin this long walk by turning back to the world these families were leaving behind. Chapter 2. Packing a Life into 12 Feet of Wood. Before the iron-banded wheels ever touched the dust of the open road, the wagon sat in the farmyard like a hollow promise. It was a 12-foot box of seasoned wood, reinforced by hands that knew their lives depended on the integrity of every bolt and plank. Neighbors gathered in the late winter chill, their voices low as they assessed the thickness of the iron wheel bands and the strength of the tongue. The canvas bonnet, brilliant and white against the gray Missouri sky, waited to be stretched over the bentwood boughs. This was the moment where a life began to be distilled into its most essential parts, weighed against the 2,000 miles of silence that lay ahead. The wagon was a pragmatic machine, a scaled-down version of the heavy freight haulers used to move commercial goods across the eastern mountains. It was roughly 4 feet wide, no larger than a modern bathroom, and designed for hauling cargo rather than protecting human bodies. There were no springs to absorb the shocks of the road, no insulation to ward off the biting prairie wind, and no padded seats for the weary. The curved sideboards were built specifically to keep heavy flour sacks and bacon slabs from shifting on the steep hillside grades. To look at the empty wagon bed was to see a vessel that demanded everything a family owned while offering almost nothing in return. Every family faced the hard arithmetic of wait before they turned their teams toward the western horizon. A fully loaded wagon weighed between 2,500 and 3,000 pounds, a burden that required the steady, slow power of 2 or 4 patient oxen. To exceed this limit was to invite a broken axle in the middle of a desert, or to exhaust the animals until they dropped in their tracks. Because of this, every object had to earn its place in the 12 feet of wooden space. The father would stand with a ledger, calculating the sacks of salt against the sacks of seed, knowing that success lived in the weight of a single heavy trunk. The base of the load was always the food, the fuel for the human machines who would walk across the continent. There were 200 pounds of flour, 150 pounds of bacon, and sacks of dried beans, rice, and cornmeal mush. 10 pounds of coffee and 20 pounds of sugar were packed deep in the center, protected from the dampness that would eventually find its way through the seams of the canvas. The smell of the provisions was overwhelming. In the enclosed space, a thick scent of salt and grain that would soon soak into the wood itself. These supplies were the most precious cargo, standing between a family and the slow starvation of the high plateau. Layered above the provisions were the tools and household goods necessary for the life they intended to build. There were heavy iron plows, saws, and axes, alongside the essential spare parts for the wagon itself. Extra wheel spokes, lengths of thick rope, and tins of axle grease were tucked into the corners. Nested among the cold iron were the cooking pails, cast iron stoves, and tin cups, their metallic clatter a constant soundtrack to the packing. Bedding was folded tight and used as padding between the heavier crates to keep the load from shifting during the jolts of the trail. Every item was a compromise between domestic comfort and the brutal necessity of the world ahead. The most difficult objects to pack were the ones that carried no practical value but held the entire weight of a family's history. There were heavy Bibles wrapped in oilcloth, family quilts stitched by grandmothers who would never see their grandchildren again, and small, fragile daguerreotypes of faces left behind. A woman might stand in her yard, holding a favorite rocking chair or a heavy mirror, realizing it could not survive the math of the journey. Watching a neighbor carry away a piece of furniture that had sat in her parlor for years was a quiet, private kind of grief. Departure required a stripping away of the self, leaving only what could fit in a wooden box. By the time the final crate was wedged into place, the interior of the wagon had become a dense, impenetrable puzzle of wood, metal, and fabric. There was almost no room left for a human being to sit, let alone sleep in any kind of comfort. The bedding was often laid directly on top of flour sacks and tool chests, creating a lumpy, uneven surface that would serve as a bed for the next 5 months. A child might find a narrow gap between a crate of beans and the sideboards to curl into, seeking shelter from the early morning wind. This was the environment where a family would spend their days, defined by objects rather than breath. Outside the wagon, the oxen stood in their heavy wooden yokes, their breath forming white mist in the cold morning air. These were large-framed animals, bred for their endurance and their ability to keep moving even when the mud reached the axles. They waited with a patient indifference, unaware that they were the engines of a mass migration that would reshape the North American continent. The clink of the heavy chains and the creak of the leather harnesses were the final sounds of preparation. A father would walk around the team one last time, checking the yokes for rubbing, knowing that his family's survival rested entirely on these slow, steady creatures. As the sun began to rise over the farm, the family gathered beside the loaded wagon for a final moment of stillness. The house behind them was already empty, its rooms echoing with the ghosts of the life they were leaving forever. The children stood in their best clothes, their faces solemn, as they looked at the neighbors who had come to say goodbye. There were no grand speeches, only the quiet press of hands and the shared understanding of the risks ahead. The first command was given. The oxen leaned into their yokes, and the iron-banded wheels made their first rotation. They did not look back more than once, for the past was already vanishing behind them. We now turn our eyes to the world they were forced to leave behind and the reasons they chose the road. Chapter 3: The World They Were Leaving. To understand the Great Walk West, we must first understand the weight of the silence left behind. In the late winter of 1852, the small farms of Missouri and Iowa were locked in a shivering, gray stillness. The transition from the loaded wagon in the yard to the fields beyond reveals why the iron wheels had to turn. These were not people chasing a shallow thrill. They were families fleeing a slow, cold suffocation. The mud in the farmyard was deep and clinging, the color of wet lead, mirroring the heavy spirit of a people who had realized that their patch of earth could no longer hold them up. Inside the root cellar, the wooden shelves told a story of exhaustion that no frontier guidebook could ever capture. A mother might stand in the dim, damp light, looking at the last few withered potatoes and the empty iron hooks where salted pork once hung. The harvests had been thin for 3 seasons, and the debt to the local merchant had grown like a weed that no hoe could kill. There is a specific kind of quiet that settles over a kitchen when the pantry is empty, a silence that rings in the ears of parents as they watch their children sleep. Staying meant watching the walls slowly close in. Out in the fields, the soil had turned a pale, listless gray, stripped of its life by years of repetitive planting and a lack of rest. A man might stand at the edge of his fence line, crumbling a clod of dirt between his calloused fingers and finding only dust. The land was either too worn out to produce or too small to support the growing needs of a household of 8. If the land was rented, the landlord's visits were becoming more frequent and his voice more sharp. The earth, which had once been a source of life, had become a hard, unforgiving surface that offered only toil. On the worn kitchen table, beneath the flickering light of a single tallow candle, lay the maps and the pamphlets that promised a different world. They spoke of the Willamette Valley in Oregon, a place where the soil was black and deep, and the timber was tall enough to touch the clouds. The words on the page described land that could be claimed for free, a gift from a government that needed bodies to hold the territory. To a man who had spent his life fighting for every inch of rented dirt, the idea of 320 acres felt like a fairy tale. The map was a paper bridge. This was the Oregon fever, but it was less a sickness and more a collective reaching for a lifeline. In the general stores of Missouri and Ohio, the air was thick with the talk of the West. Men who had never traveled more than 50 miles from their birthplace were suddenly discussing mountain passes and river crossings, as if they were familiar landmarks. They spoke of gold in California and timber in Oregon, their voices rising with a fragile, feverish hope. It was a mixture of necessity and a deep belief that a new place could create a new self, washing away the failures and the debts of the past. Before the departure could happen, the old life had to be dismantled and sold to the highest bidder. The farmyard became a marketplace of loss as neighbors arrived to pick over the remains of a household. A heavy oak bed frame, a cast iron stove, and a grandmother's rocking chair were carried away by strangers for a fraction of their worth. Each coin gathered from the sale of a cherished mirror or a spinning wheel was immediately traded for flour, bacon, or lead for bullets. It was a brutal, practical shedding of the self, a realization that memories were too heavy to carry and that sentiment could not pull a loaded wagon. The house itself began to change, its rooms growing cavernous and echoing as the furniture vanished into the wagons or onto the backs of carts. Without the rugs and the chairs and the clutter of daily living, the cracks in the floorboards became visible, highlighting the fragility of the life they were leaving. The family moved through the empty spaces like ghosts, their footsteps sounding hollow on the bare wood. They were already disconnected from the place they called home, living in a strange limbo between a world that was gone and a world they had not yet found in the West. A mother might spend her final night in the empty house folding a single quilt, her fingers tracing the patterns of fabric that represented a lifetime of quiet labor. This quilt was one of the few pieces of soft history allowed to enter the wagon, a shield against the cold nights ahead. The fabric smelled of lavender and old cedar, a scent that would soon be replaced by the sharp tang of axle grease and wood smoke. She folded her grief into the stitches, choosing to be practical because the children were watching. The children needed to believe in the road and the promise of the black soil. On the morning of the send-off, the children were dressed in their Sunday best, their faces scrubbed clean and their hair combed with a severity that felt almost like a ritual. It was a cruel irony, for these fine clothes would be in tatters long before the wagon reached the mountains of Wyoming. Their boots, polished for the last time, would soon be caked in the mud of the Platte River and worn through by the sharp stones of the high plateau. They stood beside the loaded wagon with the solemnity of small soldiers, sensing that the childhood they had known in the Missouri woods was ending. The final act of departure was the closing of the gate, a simple gesture that felt as heavy as a stone. A man might look back just once at the house he had built and the fields he had plowed, seeing them already as someone else's property. The oxen leaned into their yokes, the iron wheels creaked against the frozen mud, and the slow, rhythmic sound of the journey began. Looking back more than once was a luxury no one could afford, for the road ahead required a focus so intense that the past had to be treated as a distant, fading dream. As the wagons pulled onto the main road, joining the long line of white canvas bonnets, the feeling of suffocation began to lift, replaced by a flickering light of possibility. They were no longer debtors or struggling farmers. They were migrants, a small part of a vast human river moving toward the setting sun. The fear was still there, cold in the pit of the stomach, but it was now a fear of the unknown rather than the certainty of failure. The first few miles were a negotiation with the load and the strength of the team, a quiet beginning to the first weeks across the plains. Chapter 4. The first weeks across the plains. The first weeks on the trail brought a slow realization that time was no longer measured by the clocks left in Missouri kitchens. The wagons moved together, in organized groups of 15 to 30, creating a white canvas line that stretched across the rolling green hills of Kansas. In the early spring, the grass was deep and vibrant, moving in waves beneath a sky that felt larger than anything the migrants had ever known. Before the sun crested the horizon, the camp was already stirring with the quiet sounds of survival. The soft clink of iron chains and the low murmur of men speaking to their teams marked the transition from the deep silence of night to the labor of the day. The interior of the wagon soon developed a thick, layered atmosphere that clung to every surface and every fold of clothing. The sharp scent of mineral axle grease mixed with the salty aroma of bacon slabs stored beneath the floorboards, creating a smell that was both heavy and relentless. When the morning dampness seeped through the canvas bonnet, the scent of wet wool and dusty flour sacks added a quality to the air that felt tangible in the back of the throat. Families lived surrounded by these smells, their bodies gradually absorbing the fragrance of the trail until the world outside the wagon began to feel like a distant memory. Every object in the 12-foot box remained in its place, an intricate puzzle of necessity. Breakfast was a brief and functional affair, usually consisting of cornmeal mush, salt pork, and coffee that tasted of smoke and the bitter water of nearby creeks. The women knelt beside small fires at the edge of the wagon circle, their hands swift as they prepared enough food to sustain the walkers for the miles ahead. Hardtack biscuits, dense and dry as compressed chalk, were tacked away in pockets to be gnawed on throughout the long morning hours. There was a quiet efficiency in these early movements, a rhythm that was necessary to get the teams moving by 6 in the morning. The coffee was often the only luxury the trail allowed, a bitter warmth that offered a fragile moment of solitude before the dust began to rise. As the wagon train moved deeper into the treeless plains, the search for fuel became a daily negotiation with the landscape. Women and older children learned to scan the grass for buffalo chips, the sun-dried droppings of the great herds that had once roamed these river valleys. Gathering these discs with bare hands required a shift in domestic sensibility, a shedding of former refinement in favor of practical survival. These fires burned with a clean, hot flame, sensing a soft blue smoke into the afternoon sky that smelled distantly of sweet grass. The first time a mother knelt to feed animal dung into a cooking fire, the reality of the journey settled into her mind more deeply than any map could suggest. Children on the Oregon Trail were not mere passengers in this great migration, but active members of a mobile household. Those who were 10 years old or older spent their days walking alongside the slow-moving teams, herding loose cattle or carrying water pails from the nearest spring. They gathered wood whenever a lone cottonwood appeared in a creek bottom, stacking the precious branches beneath the wagon bed for future fires. A child in this world measured life not by years, but by the capability of their hands and the strength of their legs. They napped in small gaps between heavy crates. When the fatigue became too much, their bodies gently jolting to the relentless vibration of the iron-banded wheels moving over the ruts. The pace of the journey was dictated by the steady, unhurried gait of the oxen, which walked at roughly 2 miles per hour. These powerful animals moved with a patient indifference to the distance, their great heads lowered as they leaned into the heavy wooden yokes. Most migrants chose to walk beside the wagons rather than ride, partly to spare the teams and partly to escape the bone-shaking vibration of the unsprung wagon bed. The miles accumulated slowly, perhaps 15 on a good day, as the horizon remained forever out of reach. The repetitive sound of the hooves on soft earth and the creak of the leather harnesses became a kind of white noise that followed them from sunrise to sunset. When the spring rain arrived, it transformed the green plains into a world of heavy mud and gray uncertainty. The canvas bonnets offered a fragile protection, but the moisture always found its way through the seams, damping the bedding and chilling the souls of those seeking shelter inside. Wet wool blankets were hung from the interior bentwood boughs to dry, filling the cramped space with a close, heavy humidity that made breathing feel difficult. In these moments, the wagon felt more like a prison than a refuge, a damp box trapped in a landscape that had turned against them. Yet, the wheels continued to turn, cutting deep tracks into the sodden ground as the family kept their eyes fixed on the muddy road ahead. Evening brought the wagons into a defensive circle, a wooden fortification built to protect the livestock and the people from the growing dark. Once the fires were lit and the livestock tended, a different kind of atmosphere settled over the camp. The smell of beans and boiling coffee rose into the cool night air, and the tension of the day's labor began to soften into wariness. This was when the fiddle would appear from beneath a pile of bedding, its high, wailing notes cutting through the vast silence of the prairie. Men and women shared stories of the world they had left behind, reaching for one another through the darkness in ways that were both gentle and desperate, finding a fragile piece of comfort. Under the enormous canopy of the stars, the trail felt both infinite and tiny. A child might lay in the wagon bed, looking up through the back opening of the canvas at the Milky Way, feeling the great scale of the world pressing down on their small life. The distance to Oregon was still measured in months, not miles, and the worst trials of the mountains were still hidden beyond the western horizon. For now, the grass was high, the water was fresh, and the hope that had started this journey remained unbroken. The silence of the plains was large, but the soft sound of a sleeping family breathing, together inside the wooden box, offered a quiet proof that they were still whole. This gentle rhythm would not last, for the road ahead held the growing weight of a myth that most families were not prepared to carry. Chapter 5. The Myth of Riding West. The golden image of the pioneer family seated comfortably in the wagon bed is one of the most persistent fictions of the Oregon Trail. In reality, the dusty road west was lined not with passengers, but with walkers who had discovered that the interior of a prairie schooner was a place of constant physical labor. A mother might walk beside the front wheel, her hand resting on the rough wooden sideboard, her shoes wearing thin against the sharp grit of the Platte River Road. She walked to spare the oxen, and she walked because the violent jolting of the unsprung wagon turned every mile into a bruising trial for the human body. Inside the wagon box, every rock and root was transmitted directly through the iron-banded wheels and wooden axles into the very bones of anyone attempting to ride. Without a single spring to soften the impact, the wagon became a moving machine of shuddering vibration. People who attempted to ride for long stretches described it as a sustained assault that left their hips and backs blue with bruises. A child might try to sit atop a sack of flour, but a single deep rut could throw them violently against the heavy tool chests or the hard iron cookware. Eventually, even the smallest children found that walking in the heat was preferable to the brutal rhythm of the wagon bed. The true master of the journey was not the driver, but the weight of the load and the strength of the oxen. These patient creatures were a family's only lifeline across the continent, and their health was guarded with a desperation that bordered on religious devotion. Every unnecessary pound in the wagon stressed the axles and exhausted the team, shortening the distance they could cover before the water sources dried up. If an ox broke down in the high country of Wyoming or Idaho, it was often a death sentence for the family depending on its strength. Consequently, the decision to ride was not a matter of comfort, but a dangerous withdrawal from the bank of life. As the terrain began to rise and the grass became sparse, the hard arithmetic of survival forced families to reevaluate everything they had packed with such hope in Missouri. A man might stand in the middle of the road at high noon, wiping alkali dust from his eyelids, looking at his laboring team with growing dread. He could see the exact moment when the hope of keeping his possessions collided with the necessity of keeping his children alive. This was the moment when the tailgate was dropped and the first heavy items were heaved into the high prairie grass. The road behind them began to look like a scattered trail of discarded ambition. The first to go were often the cast iron stoves, symbols of domestic civilization that weighed hundreds of pounds and offered nothing to the weakened oxen. Imagine a heavy stove lying on its side in the Nebraska dust, its iron doors hanging open like a mouth, gasping for breath in the heat. It was an object designed for a kitchen floor, not a mountain pass, and its abandonment marked the end of one kind of life. Nearby, a heavy oak bureau might be left behind, its drawers empty and its polished wood already beginning to crack under the unforgiving western sun. These were not just objects. They were the physical fragments of a world being systematically stripped away. Travelers who arrived later in the season described the trail as an open-air museum of abandoned ambition, where every mile held a new monument to loss. Mirrors were leaned against sagebrush, reflecting only the empty sky and the passing wagons. Spinning wheels stewed motionless in the wind, their delicate spokes stilled by the reality of the desert. Rocking chairs were left to rot in the rain, their graceful curves looking strangely out of place beside the sun-bleached bones of dead cattle. The road was a long, dusty ledger of every calculation that had failed, recording the exact point where the dreams of the past finally became too heavy for the reality of the present. One of the most haunting images recorded in trail diaries was that of a piano sitting alone near the South Platte River crossing. It sat with its lid open, its ivory keys yellowing in the sun, surrounded by nothing but the great silence of the plains. No one could say for certain who had carried it so far, or what desperate hope had convinced them it could be saved. Perhaps a mother had dreamed of playing music in an Oregon parlor, only to watch the oxen sink to their knees in the mud. Now, the only music it produced was the sound of the wind whistling through its strung wire, a ghostly note for the passing walkers. Even smaller items were not immune to the relentless culling required by the road. Bibles, family records, and heavy crates of books were placed in small piles beside the ruts, their pages fluttering like the wings of trapped birds in the dust. A child might drop a school slate to save a pint of water, or a woman might leave behind her mother's best china dishes to lighten the load by 12 pounds. Each abandoned object represented a piece of identity being cast aside, leaving the migrants thinner, harder, and more anonymous with every mile. They were no longer the people who had left Missouri. They were becoming the people of the road. The long line of walkers continued westward, leaving behind a landscape littered with the heavy remnants of their former lives. They moved toward the horizon with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the remaining sacks of flour tucked deep inside the wagon box. The myth of the comfortable carriage had vanished, replaced by the steady, painful rhythm of one foot moving in front of the other across the burning alkali flats. As the evening light faded over the discarded stoves and the broken mirrors, the trail settled into a deep, indifferent silence. The road was now the only truth they had left to follow, leading them toward the geography of false hope. Chapter 6: Guidebooks, Shortcuts, and the Geography of False Hope. As the wagons moved deeper into the unknown, the families clung to their guidebooks with a devotion that bordered on the sacred. By the light of a single tallow candle inside the cramped wagon, a father might spend his evening hours tracing a finger over a worn map, searching for a way to trim miles from the 2,000 that lay ahead. The most famous of these books was The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, written by a man named Lansford Hastings in the year 1845. It was a small volume with paper the color of old straw, promised to lead the weary toward a paradise that felt increasingly distant with every dusty mile traversed. The great irony of these books, which many migrants did not discover until they were deep in the Great Basin, was that some of their authors had never fully walked the ground they described. Lansford Hastings had looked at the western landscape on map sheets and imagined a shortcut through the Great Salt Lake Desert that would save hundreds of miles. His words promised a route that was manageable and efficient, ignoring the brutal reality of waterless flats and crushing heat. For a family exhausted by months of walking, the allure of a shortcut was a powerful poison, shading their better judgment with the fragile light of an easier tomorrow. The choice at a fork in the road was the most meaningful moment of the journey, a quiet pivot point where a life could be saved or lost. A wagon captain would stand beneath the immense sky, looking at a small post in the ground that pointed toward the unknown, while the group debated the merits of the printed word. The guidebooks described the prairie as park-like and the river crossings as trivial, using language designed to sell the journey rather than prepare the traveler for its costs. This manufactured optimism created a dangerous distance between the hope in the heart and the hard ground beneath the iron wheels. By the mid-1840s, the memory of the Donner Party had become a shadowed warning passed from campfire to campfire like a heavy prayer. These families had followed the Hastings cutoff in the year 1846, believing the promise of a shorter way only to find themselves trapped in the Sierra Nevada as the October snows began to fall. To the immigrants on the trail in later years, this was not an obscure tale from a textbook, but a vivid and recent history. They spoke of the pass in whispers, calculating their own speed against the calendar, knowing that a single week of delay could turn a trail into a grave. The Great Migration of 1843, the first large organized train to move west, had reached the Columbia River in a state of near total collapse. They had arrived in November, their animals dead and their supplies depleted to the last handful of flour, having discovered that the road was far more relentless than the early reports suggested. Their journey served as proof that the trail was possible, but it also revealed the bone-deep depletion that came from months of sustained effort. The families who followed them carried this knowledge in their silence, watching the sky for the first sign of early winter clouds over the distant mountain peaks. Inside the wagon, the guidebook sat beside the family Bible, both books offering different kinds of salvation in an indifferent world. A mother might look at the map and see a thin line representing a river, only to arrive and find a swollen, raging current that demanded everything her family had left to give. The books failed to describe the smell of dead cattle in the summer heat or the way the alkali dust burned the inside of one's eyelids. They provided the structure of the journey, but they left out the texture of the suffering, creating a blueprint of hope that often crumbled upon contact with the physical earth. The psychology of the trail was shaped by this ongoing negotiation with bad information and false promises. Some migrants arrived at the South Pass and found it to be a gentle, broad saddle rather than the dramatic summit they had imagined, leading to a dangerous sense of relief. They did not realize that the hardest stretches, the Green River, the Snake River, and the Blue Mountains, were still waiting for them in the West. The geography of false hope was a mental map where the difficulties were minimized and the rewards were magnified, keeping the wagons moving even when common sense should have dictated a halt. One of the most haunting visuals recorded in the diaries was the sight of a wagon train stopped at a diverging rut, with several families reading aloud from conflicting guides. The wind would catch the paper pages, threatening to tear them from the binding, while the oxen lowered their great heads in the dust. In that moment, the printed word held more power than the visible horizon, as men tried to reconcile the optimism of a New York publisher with the harshness of the high plateau. They were operating on hope rather than knowledge, steering their freight haulers into a future that had been polished by someone else's profit. As the journey progressed, the guidebooks were often discarded beside the road, joining the cast iron stoves and the broken bureaus in the grass. The migrants discovered that the only true guide was the earth itself and the collective experience of those moving beside them. They learned to read the clouds, the current of the rivers, and the subtle changes in the scent of the air, developing a competence that no volume could teach. The geography of false hope slowly faded, replaced by a hard-won realism that was both exhausting and essential for their survival. They were no longer following a book. They were carried by the road. The wagon train moved onward, a small island of human uncertainty in a vast landscape that had been known and managed long before the white canvas arrived. They did not yet realize that while they searched for their place in the world, they were crossing through the living homelands of people who watched their slow progress from the ridge lines. The road cut by the iron wheels was a new scar on an old world, one that did not need a guidebook to understand its own history. We now turn our eyes toward the hills, where the land was never empty. Chapter 7. The land was not empty. While the families inside the wagons focused their eyes on the narrow dust of the road, they were being watched by eyes that had known this land for thousands of years. From the high ridge lines above the Platte River and the granite bluffs of the Snake River Plain, Shoshone and Pawnee families observed the slow progress of the white canvas bonnets. To the migrants, the horizon felt like a void to be filled, but to those on the hills, the trail was a foreign intrusive line cutting through a managed and familiar world. The land was not a wilderness. It was a map of memory, seasonal movement, and ancient diplomacy that the iron wheels could not read. The plains that the immigrants described as wild were actually a carefully maintained economy of grass and fire. Indigenous nations, including the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, utilized sophisticated land management to ensure the health of the soil and the movement of the great buffalo herds. The vast meadows of tall grass were not accidental, but were shaped by generations of knowledge that balanced the needs of the people with the life of the earth. When the wagon trains arrived, they did not find an untouched Eden but a productive country with its own roads, its own borders, and its own deeply rooted systems of governance that had sustained millions of human beings. At the center of this world was the buffalo, a living economy that darkened the horizon in herds so large they took days to pass a single point. These animals represented food, shelter, trade, and spiritual continuity for the plains nations, their hoofbeats sounding like distant thunder against the hard earth. The Oregon Trail acted as a permanent zone of disruption for these herds, pushing them away from the vital river valleys where they traditionally watered. As the number of wagons grew into the thousands, the buffalo began to thin along the trail corridor, creating a quiet crisis for the communities whose entire way of life depended on the animals' presence. Early relations between the migrants and the indigenous peoples were often defined by practical cooperation rather than the violence of later mythology. In the 1840s, it was common to see a Shoshone guide pointing out a hidden spring or a group of Pawnee men trading fresh buffalo meat for flour and iron tools. Indigenous communities operated extensive trade networks and frequently assisted families in crossing dangerous rivers or finding stray livestock. These interactions were human and immediate, built on a mutual understanding that survival in this vast country required a certain level of pragmatic exchange. The wagon trains were initially seen as a new variable in an existing world of commerce. Fort Laramie stood as a physical landmark of this developing relationship, a dusty trading post where different worlds collided over counters, piled high with furs and provisions. Originally established to support the fur trade, it became a vital waypoint where indigenous leaders and American officials attempted to codify peace through treaties, such as the one signed in 1851. In these early years, the atmosphere at the fort was one of high-stakes diplomacy and cautious trade, where horses changed hands beside piles of calico cloth. The leaders of the great nations looked at the growing stream of immigrants with a particular clarity, recognizing that the flood was only beginning to rise. However, the physical impact of the migration was becoming impossible to ignore as the trail widened year after year. Because the early ruts became too deep for the wagons, newer trains cut parallel tracks into the virgin sod, creating a wide scar that stretched for hundreds of yards across the prairie. This erosion destroyed the fragile grazing land that sustained both the buffalo and the indigenous horse herds, leading to increasing friction over the scarcity of resources. The immigrants' cattle consumed the grass near water sources, leaving behind a dusty waste where lush meadows once flourished. The land was being consumed by the sheer volume of people passing through it to reach somewhere else. As the years progressed toward the late 1850s, the relationship began to shift from trade toward conflict, as federal policy favored the settlement of the West at any cost. Treaties were broken as quickly as the ink dried, and the buffalo herds continued to vanish beneath the pressure of passive disruption and active hunting. The indigenous nations watched as their traditional hunting grounds were legally treated as empty spaces in government land offices thousands of miles away. The compassion and guidance offered in the early years were increasingly replaced by a necessary resistance to a movement that no longer asked permission to cross the sacred ground of others. The covered wagon, which represented hope and a fresh start from the inside, was viewed as an omen from the outside. To a Shoshone mother watching from the ridge, the white canvas trains looked like a slow, relentless flood that would eventually sweep away the world her children inherited. She understood that the people in the wagons were not just passing through, but were the advance guard of a system that did not value the continuity of her people's life. The beauty of the Oregon sunset was tempered by the reality of the disruption left in the wake of the wheels, a debt that the mythology of the frontier would rarely acknowledge. The families in the wagons continued their journey, mostly unaware of the deep history and the living cultures they were displacing with every mile. They saw themselves as brave survivors facing a harsh landscape, never realizing that their survival was often made possible by the land management and early assistance of those they would eventually supplant. The road led them away from the plains and toward one specific one whose pen would record the quiet devastation of the trail better than any other. We now follow the path of Amelia Stewart Knight, who carried her own household across the Continental Divide. Chapter 8, Amelia Stewart Knight and the Women Who Kept Moving. This chapter anchors the vast migration in the life of one historical witness, using the plain words of Amelia Stewart Knight to reveal the unrelenting labor of women on the trail. We follow her journey from the first farewell to the birth of her child in the rain-drenched forests of Oregon. Her name was Amelia Stewart Knight, and on the 9th of April in the year 1853, she climbed into a wagon in Monroe County, Iowa. She was 33 years old, a woman of quiet fortitude who had already spent 13 years managing a growing household on the frontier. Beside her sat 7 children, ranging from a toddler barely walking to a 13-year-old son already weighted with the responsibilities of a man. Hidden beneath her practical wool dress was the secret of an 8th child, a life growing in the midst of a great departure. She held a small leather-bound diary in her lap, its pages waiting to record a journey that no map could fully explain. The first entry in her diary was plain and marked by a deliberate choice of language that carried the weight of forever. She wrote that she had bid adieu to Monroe County and all its kind friends and relatives, using that specific word to mark a farewell she knew was permanent. The ink was fresh and dark against the paper as she sat within the narrow confines of the wagon bed, surrounded by the piled sacks of flour and the essential tools of survival. Outside, the oxen groaned against their yokes, and the first great turning of the iron-banded wheels signaled the end of her known world. She was not a heroine in her own mind, but a mother with a pen. By the 13th of April, the early optimism of the departure was replaced by the relentless reality of black Missouri mud. The road south of the Missouri River had become a sucking, bottomless mess that swallowed the wheels to their hubs and strained the hearts of both men and beasts. Amelia watched from the tailgate as her husband and older sons heaved against the wooden spokes, their boots caked in thick layers of heavy earth. The wagons moved only a few miles each day, a slow and discouraging crawl through a landscape that seemed determined to hold them in place. She recorded the struggle without embellishment, her handwriting steady despite the exhaustion that was already beginning to settle into her shoulders. As the calendar moved toward late April, a different kind of misery entered the wagon in the form of low-grade illness. Her children began to cycle through colds and intestinal complaints, their small faces turning pale beneath the gray light of the canvas bonnet. Amelia spent her nights tending to feverish bodies in the damp darkness, using whatever remedies she had stored in her small medical chest. She mentioned her own condition only obliquely, using the word condition to mask the physical toll of her pregnancy as the wagon jolted over the deep ruts. There was no place for delicate health on the trail, only the practical necessity of keeping the household moving 1 mile at a time. The month of May brought the flat stretch of the Platte River Road, where the wind came off the high plains with a force that shook the heavy wagon. The air was bone-dry, turning the ground into a fine dust that found every gap in the canvas and coated every surface in a gritty layer of gray. Amelia noted the way her hands began to crack and bleed from the constant work and the harsh atmosphere of the Nebraska plains. Her daughter Plutarch and her son Seneca fell sick, adding to the growing burden of care that she carried while walking beside the team. The diary recorded the mosquitoes, the wind, and the dust as a constant, relentless background to their slow progress westward. In June, the trail crossed into territories where cholera had begun to ravage, the wagon trains moving ahead of them. Amelia recorded the sight of fresh graves beside the road, raw mounds of earth, marked with rough boards that bore the names of strangers. Some markers spoke simply of a good wife and mother, while others carried only the heartbreaking words, "Our child." She passed these silent sentinels without adding her own commentary, but the plainness of her records captured the internal dread of a mother with 7 children at risk. She knew that to stop was to die, and so she kept her pen moving and her wagon rolling past the heavy stones. By the time July arrived, the lengthy paragraphs in her diary had compressed into short, exhausted sentences that reflected a bone-deep depletion. She wrote of dusty roads, disagreeable weather, and the terror of mosquitoes that swarmed around the night fires in such clouds that they nearly smothered the flames. The entry, for one day, might only note that her husband was sick. The children were fussy, and they had traveled 15 miles through the heat. This compression was not a lack of interest, but the physical limit of a woman writing at the end of a day that had emptied her of everything except the will to continue. Every word was a victory over fatigue. The labor of being a woman on the Oregon Trail meant maintaining the infrastructure of domestic life in a world without walls. Amelia managed the rations, cooked over buffalo chip fires in the high wind, and kept 7 children clothed and fed while her own body grew heavier with pregnancy. She was representative of thousands of women who performed the essential work of migration without the benefit of a soft bed or a private space. Her endurance was not a performance for history, but a practical strategy for the survival of her family. She was a witness to the plain fact that the frontier was won not by dramatic deeds, but by the steady rinsing of clothes in brown river water. In the middle of September, within the rainy green forests of western Oregon, Amelia reached the end of her longest negotiation with the road. On the 17th day of the month, in a wagon camp wet with early autumn rain, her 8th child was born. She recorded the event in a single sentence in her diary, noting only that her son Jefferson had arrived safe into the world. The very next entry returned to the practical matters of weather and road conditions, for the journey was not quite finished. She continued to move her family toward the Willamette Valley, carrying her newborn son in her arms as the iron wheels made their final rotations toward a new life. Today, that small diary lives within the quiet vaults of the Washington State Historical Society, its pages aged to the color of old tea. If you look closely at the handwriting, you can see the careful, small script of a woman who did not waste paper because she understood its value. The faded ink is a direct connection to a specific cold morning in September and a specific woman who refused to let the road erase her voice. She arrived in Oregon not as a myth, but as a mother who had proven the strength of her own capability through every mile. Her words remain a window into the truth of the trail, a truth that lives in the hard arithmetic of survival. Amelia's arrival marked only the beginning of a new struggle to turn the geography of crisis into a permanent home. Chapter 9. The Geography of Crisis. Somewhere around the 6th week on the trail, a subtle and frightening shift occurred in the daily thinking of the migrants. The novelty of the vast horizon had worn thin, replaced by a mathematical obsession with what remained inside the wagon box. Families who had once gazed at the stars now spent their evenings measuring flour by the cup and counting bacon slabs with trembling hands. The Oregon Trail had entered its geography of crisis, where every mile was no longer just a distance to be crossed, but a withdrawal from a finite bank of survival. The atmosphere in the camp grew quiet and calculating as the reality of their depletion settled into every conversation beside the fading fires. The first major physical barrier arrived at the South Platte River crossing, a treacherous stretch of brown water that could change its character in a single afternoon. To the eye, the river looked wide and shallow, but beneath the surface lay shifting sands and unpredictable currents driven by rains far upstream. A father would stand on the bank, watching a leading wagon tilt dangerously as its wheels sank into a hidden soft spot in the riverbed. The sound of rushing water against the sideboards was a reminder of how quickly a lifeline could become a trap. Crossing safely required a mixture of luck and exhausting labor, leaving the families drenched, shaken, and deeper in debt to the road. Fort Laramie offered the first honest reckoning with the financial cost of the dream. For families arriving from Missouri, the fort was a place to resupply, but the prices charged by merchants were staggering proof of their desperation. Flour that had cost only a few cents a pound back home was now sold for $1 a pound, and bacon prices rose to equally exploitative heights. A man might stand at the trading counter, looking at his diminishing coins and then at his children, realizing that his careful planning had not accounted for the greed of the frontier. They bought only what was essential, rationing even more harshly as they pointed their teams toward the rising grades of the mountains. Past the fort, the easy flatlands of the Platte Valley vanished, replaced by the broken, rising country of the Wyoming High Plateau. The wagons groaned differently on these steeper grades, their wooden frames flexing and creaking beneath the strain of the ascent. Men put their shoulders to the iron-banded spokes, pushing alongside the oxen while dust from the dry earth coated their lungs and stung their eyes. The sound of stressed wood and straining leather became the constant soundtrack to their labor, a warning that every joint in the wagon was being tested to its absolute limit. There was no room for error when the grade turned sharp and the ground turned to loose stone. Independence Rock stood in the Sweetwater Valley as a psychological waypoint, a massive granite dome rising from the high plains like the back of a great beast. Immigrants traditionally aimed to reach this landmark by the 4th of July, knowing that reaching it later meant the October snows of the mountains might close the passes forever. Thousands of names were carved into the soft stone, a silent ledger of everyone who had survived this far. A woman might run her fingers over the letters of a friend's name carved weeks before, feeling a fragile connection to those moving ahead of her. It was a moment to breathe, to sign one's own name in the earth, and to face the divide. South Pass proved to be less dramatic than the paintings had suggested, appearing as a broad and gentle saddle rather than a jagged summit. Yet, crossing this continental divide was a moment of profound significance, marking the point where the waters began to flow toward the Pacific Ocean. The relief of reaching the summit was tempered by the knowledge that the hardest terrain, the Green River and the Snake River, lay directly ahead in the west. The wind over the pass carried a new sharpness, a scent of high altitude and distance that reminded every traveler that the shelter of the Willamette Valley was still hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. The descent into the basin had begun. The trail then dropped into the Alkali Desert, a landscape that seemed specifically designed to kill the livestock that carried the families. The white crust of salt on the earth reflected the relentless sun, burning the eyelids and turning the air into a shimmering wall of heat. Water in the seeps and springs often looked drinkable but was poisonous to the cattle, leading to catastrophic losses that lined the road with carcasses. An ox that had been sturdy for 1,000 miles could sicken and die within 48 hours, forcing families to unhitch the dead weight and abandon more of their possessions to lighten the load. The roadside discards grew denser here, marking the points where survival outweighed sentiment. Of all the stretches on the long road, the Humboldt River Valley was perhaps the most demoralizing to the human spirit. The water was heavily mineralized and bitter. The grass for the animals was sparse, and the dust was so pervasive that it seemed to coat the very thoughts of the travelers. For over 300 miles, families followed this geological anomaly through the heat, watching the mountains of the Sierra Nevada loom like a shadow on the horizon. The silence of the Humboldt was not peaceful. It was the silence of exhaustion. People who had started with songs and conversation now moved in a mute, gritty trance, their only goal to reach the next bitter water source. As the high passes of the mountains finally appeared through the dust, the families felt a mixture of dread and disbelief. They had come so far, abandoned so much, and buried so many. Yet the greatest physical barrier still stood between them and the end of the road. The geography of crisis had stripped them down to their most essential selves, leaving them hardened, weary, and deeply dependent on one another. They looked toward the dark peaks of the Sierra and the Cascades, calculating the weeks left in the season and the remaining strength in their teams. The road was now a narrow line between arrival and the coming winter, moving toward the work of survival. If you found peace in this slow journey through the dust of the Oregon Trail, please quietly like and subscribe to hear more stories from the deep silence of history. Chapter 10: Rivers, Graves, and the Work of Survival. The roar of the Snake River at Three Island Ford was a sound that lived in the nightmares of the migrants long before they reached its banks. It was a wide, muscular current, the color of churned earth and heavy, with the melt of distant mountain snows. Families stewed on the high bluffs, looking down at the brown water as it raced toward the Pacific, realizing that their only path forward lay directly through the flood. The iron-banded wheels of the wagons looked fragile against the scale of the river, and the air was thick with the scent of wet stone and cold spray. This was the moment where the geography of the trail demanded a physical gamble with the lives of everyone inside the wooden box. Preparation for the crossing was a ritual of desperate engineering, performed with the few tools and materials the trail had not yet stripped away. Men knelt beside their wagons, packing every gap and seam of the box with black tar or pine pitch to create a fragile hull. The smell of the heated bitumen rose in the humid air, mingling with the scent of the stressed oxen waiting near the water's edge. Crates of flour and tools were lashed to the sideboards to prevent them from shifting if the wagon began to float or tilt in the deepest part of the current. It was an act of turning a freight hauler into a boat, a transformation born of necessity and guided by fear. The act of crossing began with the unhitching of the oxen, who were driven into the current to swim separately from the heavy wagons. The great animals lowered their heads, their nostrils flaring as they felt the force of the water against their massive chests. Behind them, the wagons were driven or towed into the river, the wooden wheels spinning uselessly as the current took hold of the frame. The groan of the timber as it resisted the pressure of the water was a sound of structural agony, audible even above the roar of the river. One wrong move, one soft patch of sand, and the entire world of a family could vanish beneath the brown surface in a matter of seconds. Inside the wagons, the children were not left to chance. They were carried through the roaring current in the arms of the adults. Men and women waded into the chest-deep water, feeling the muscular push of the river against their legs, while they held their small burdens high above the spray. The water was bitterly cold, a reminder of the high altitudes they had recently crossed, chilling the bone even through heavy wool clothing. A mother might cling to her child's neck, her eyes fixed on the far bank, refusing to look down at the rushing silt below. It was a walk of pure concentration, where every step on the shifting riverbed was a negotiation with gravity and grace. Not every wagon surfaced on the other side of the ford. Sometimes a rope would snap with a sound like a pistol shot, releasing a wagon into the unrestricted force of the current to be swept downstream. The silence that followed. Such an accident was more terrifying than the roar of the water, as the group watched their possessions and their history sink into the mud. If a life was lost in the crossing, there was often no body to recover, only the sight of a floating canvas bonnet vanishing around a bend in the river. The survivors stood on the far bank, drenched and shaken, realizing that the trail had claimed another debt that could never be repaid. Beyond the rivers lay an even more terrifying enemy, an invisible force that swept through the wagon trains with the speed of a summer storm. Cholera was the great terror of the 1850s, a disease that could take a man from perfect health at sunrise to a shallow grave by the light of the evening stars. It struck with a randomness that felt like judgment, turning vibrant camps into places of quiet, dehydrated despair. The blue tint of the skin and the sunken eyes of the sick were sights that haunted the survivors for decades. In the cramped darkness of the wagon bed, families tended to their dying relatives with nothing but tepid water and final prayers. Burial on the trail was a task of brief, devastating utility, performed in the shadow of the relentless need to keep moving. The ground was often hard and unforgiving, requiring men to use their best shovels to dig graves that were rarely more than 2 or 3 feet deep. A body was wrapped in a spare quilt, or a simple shroud of flour sacks, placed into the earth without the comfort of a coffin or a proper stone. The service was often short, consisting of a few verses from the family Bible read over the sound of the rising wind. Every shovelful of earth was a promise to never forget a person the trail was forcing them to leave behind forever. To protect the dead from the scavengers of the plains, families employed a final, secretive strategy of camouflage. Once the grave was filled, they might lay heavy stones over the mound or build a fire directly above the site to hide the scent of the fresh earth. Some wagon trains chose to drive their teams and heavy wheels directly over the grave, packing the soil until it was indistinguishable from the ruts of the main road. It was a final act of protection, ensuring that the remains of a loved one would not be disturbed by wolves in the long nights after the wagons had vanished over the western horizon. The dead remained part of the trail. In the midst of this relentless loss, a fragile and essential system of mutual aid kept many families from total collapse. When a father died of cholera, neighbors would step in to drive his team, yoking their own oxen to his wagon to keep his widow and children moving toward Oregon. If a flour sack was discovered to be rotten, the rest of the train would reach into their own stores, measuring out cups of grain to ensure no one starved in the high plateau. This was not the individualism of the mythology, but a communal survival strategy built on the recognition that no family could survive alone. The group was the only shield. The evening camps after a day of loss were marked by a heavy, respectful silence that settled over the wagon circle. The sound of a fiddle might still rise into the night air, but the tunes were slower, reaching for the memories of the East rather than the hope of the West. People visited between the wagons, bringing small portions of dried fruit or extra blankets to those who had lost everything, in a river or a fever. These small gestures of human grace were the invisible architecture of the Oregon Trail, proving that even in the most brutal environments, the instinct to care for one another could not be fully eroded by hardship. Survival was ultimately a matter of persistence rather than heroic triumph. By morning, the routine would resume with the same slow inevitability as the rising sun. The oxen were yoked, the damp canvas was secured, and the families stepped back into the dust of the road, leaving their grief behind them in the grass. They moved forward because there was no alternative, their eyes fixed on the distant peaks of the Blue Mountains or the Cascades. The trail had taken much from them, but it had also hammered them into a people who understood that the only medicine for sorrow was the steady, forward motion of the iron wheels toward the unknown. This physical endurance was part of a larger engine, a hidden machinery of policy and profit that drove the wagons toward their final destination. Chapter 11. The Machinery Beneath the Dream. This chapter reveals the invisible forces that drove the Great Migration, moving from the personal struggle of the wagon to the legal, political, and economic systems that manage the westward flow. We observe the trail as a product of policy, promotion, and calculated national ambition. In the quiet, dusty offices of Missouri newspaper editors, a different kind of trail was being built, one made of ink and promises. Tall stacks of news sheets, fresh from the press, carried headlines that sang of rich, black Oregon soil and valleys where the rain was always gentle. An editor might sit by a window at dusk, his fingers stained with lead, crafting sentences that described a paradise he had never seen. These papers traveled far to the east, reaching hands that were tired of renting and hearts that were hungry for ownership. To the reader, the words were a lifeline. To the machinery of the nation, they were the fuel that kept the migration moving toward the sunset. In the outfitting towns of Independence and St. Joseph, the air was thick with the scent of new leather and the clatter of 100 hammers. Merchants stood behind long wooden counters, weighing out salt and lead with a precision that favored the house. They provided recommended lists of supplies that were generous, in ways that happened to increase the sale, suggesting more flour and more bacon than any single wagon could reasonably carry. A family might spend their life savings here, in a single afternoon, buying crates of tools and bags of seed they would eventually jettison in the Nebraska dust. The profit of the town was built entirely on the fever of departure. Behind the wooden desks of government land offices, the Oregon Trail was understood not as a journey, but as a legal transaction. In the year 1850, the Donation Land Claim Act was signed into law, offering 320 acres of free land to any white male citizen who could reach the territory. A clerk might dip his pen into a deep inkwell, recording the names of those who intended to claim their piece of the far Northwest. This act turned every migrant into an instrument of national expansion, a living marker used to hold the earth against foreign claims. The dream of ownership was the engine, but the law was the track. On the large maps spread across these government tables, the landscape was depicted as a series of blank spaces and orderly grids. The traditional homelands of the Cayuse, the Tillamook, and the Umpqua were treated as if they were legally invisible, erased by a single stroke of a cartographer's pen. A man might trace the line of the Columbia River with his thumb, seeing only available timber and water where others saw 1,000 years of ancestry. By describing the land as empty, the machinery of the state made it possible for the wagons to move without the burden of permission. The silence of the map was the loudest part of the entire journey. This was a managed migration, a strategic movement of people designed to assert American sovereignty over a disputed territory. Every family that survived the high passes and every child that walked the plains was serving a political purpose they rarely discussed beside their campfires. They were the settlers who would populate the frontier, providing the human weight necessary to secure the border against British interests. The government established military forts like Laramie and Kearney not just to protect the travelers, but to maintain a permanent presence in a country they intended to keep. The wagon was the hero of the story, but the flag followed the iron-banded wheel. At remote mission stations like the one established by Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, the spiritual and the political merged in the fading light of the afternoon. The mission buildings at Waialatpu stood as a vital waypoint for the Great Migration, providing a place of rest and a promise of civilization in the deep interior. While their primary mission was religious, the Whitmans also functioned as tireless advocates for American immigration, writing letters home that encouraged thousands to risk the crossing. Their presence anchored the trail, offering a psychological comfort to the weary, even as the local Cayuse people watched the rising tide of strangers with a growing and justified alarm. At the swollen river crossings, the machinery of the trail became visible in the form of a heavy, frayed ferry rope stretched across the current. Here, entrepreneurs had built small empires on the desperation of the families who had run out of strength to ford the water. A ferryman might stand on a wooden barge, his face hardened by the sun, charging a price for a single crossing that could have fed a family for a month. Immigrants who had managed their mound finances miles found themselves at the mercy of a market that had no competitors. They paid the price in gold or goods, watching their last reserves vanish into a stranger's pocket. The merchants and the outfitters in the eastern towns understood that an immigrant in the fever of departure was a man who had stopped making cool-headed decisions. They sold heavy iron stoves and furniture that they knew would be abandoned by the time the wagons reached the Platte, and then they bought them back from returning travelers for pennies. The economy of the trail was a cycle of consumption and waste, where the suffering of the many fueled the prosperity of the few who stayed behind. The dream of the West was a managed product, and the price was paid in sweat, in loss, and in the fragile currency of hope. As the wagons moved closer to the Willamette Valley, the hidden systems that had guided them began to fade into the background of a new reality. The land claim papers were tucked deep into the family Bible, waiting to be presented at a desk in Oregon City. The families had survived the greed of the ferrymen and the optimism of the guidebooks. But the machinery of the nation was not finished with them yet. They were moving toward a place where the arrival was only the beginning of a different kind of labor. The destination was finally coming into view through the rain-streaked canvas, marking the final stage of the road. The machinery beneath the dream had done its work, delivering a population into a landscape that was forever changed by their presence. Now, the wagons turned their wheels toward the final forests of the West, where the promise of the road would be tested by the reality of the earth. The iron hoops of the wheels still creaked, but the sound was now different, carrying the weight of arrival in every heavy rotation. In the mist of the far Northwest, the families looked for the land that had been promised to them in the newspaper sheets. They were ready to step out of the wagon and into the place at the end of the road. Chapter 12. The Place at the End of the Road. The air changed first, losing the dry, biting scent of alkali dust and replacing it with the heavy, sweet fragrance of cedar and rain. As the wagons crested the final ridge of the Cascades, the Willamette Valley appeared below, a vast basin of deep greens and misty grays that felt like a different planet. The iron-banded wheels, which had groaned through 2,000 miles of sun-bleached desert, now sank into the soft, dark loam of the Pacific Northwest. There was no orchestral music to greet them, only the steady drip of water from the cedar boughs and the low, exhausted lowing of the remaining oxen. The journey was ending in the mist. Stepping out of the wagon for the final time was a strange, disorienting act of liberation. For months, the wooden box had been their entire world, their bedroom, their pantry, and their shield, and now it stood empty in a muddy clearing, its canvas bonnet gray, with age and torn by 100 storms. A mother might run her hand along the scarred sideboards, feeling the deep ruts left by the chains and the faint scent of bacon grease still trapped in the grain. The interior, once packed so tightly with their history, was now a hollow space of wooden planking and dust. The wagon was no longer a home. It was a relic of the road they had survived. The paradise promised by the guidebooks and the newspaper editors proved to be a real place, filled with its own specific difficulties and demands. The rich soil was indeed black and deep, but it was hidden beneath ancient forests that required years of backbreaking labor to clear. Families who had dreamed of instant salvation found themselves standing in the rain, hammering land claim stakes into the mud and sleeping under their wagons while they built their first crude cabins. The fresh start was real, but it was not a gift. It was a new kind of negotiation with the earth. The gap between the imagined Oregon and the actual place was filled with the sound of axes. Settlement required a different kind of strength than the trail, a persistence that traded the forward motion of the road for the stationary labor of the farm. A man might stand in a clearing he had made, his shoulders aching from the weight of a heavy cedar log, looking at a landscape that was entirely indifferent to his arrival. The silence of the Oregon woods was different from the silence of the plains. It was heavy and damp, pressing in on the small cabins like a physical weight. Yet the work continued, fueled by the same stubborn hope that had carried them across the Snake River. Every fence line built was a new mark on the world. The arrival of the wagons was the final chapter in a much older story of displacement that the mythology would later try to erase. As the families built their homes, the Kalapuya and the Umpqua peoples were being moved onto reservations like Grand Ronde, their ancient relationship with the valley severed by the legal machinery of the settlers. A family might look out from their new porch at dusk and see a figure watching from the edge of the trees, a silent reminder that their fresh start came at a cost paid by someone else. The land was being remade in the image of the East, a transformation that required the prior inhabitants to become invisible. Those who survived the trail were bound together by a shared memory of dust and loss that no one else could fully understand. In the new settlements, survivors of the same wagon train often stayed close, building their lives near the people who had helped them bury their children or cross a swollen river. They gathered in the evenings by the fireplace, the light of the flames catching the worn faces of men and women who had aged a decade in a single season. They spoke of Independence Rock and the Alkali Flats not as grand adventures, but as hard facts of a life that had tested their absolute limits. They were a community forged by the road. Amelia Stewart Knight lived out her days on a farm in Polk County, her 8th child Jefferson growing up in the very soil she had suffered to reach. Her small diary, with its faded ink and careful penmanship, remained a quiet witness to the texture of her labor and the reality of her endurance. When she looked at the green hills of Oregon, she likely remembered the raw mounds of earth beside the Platte River and the mosquitoes that swarmed in the heat of Nebraska. Her legacy was not a monument of stone, but the simple fact of a family that had survived because she refused to let the road break her spirit. The diary remains a quiet truth. Soon after the iron-banded wheels stopped turning, the process of myth-making began to polish the rough edges of the real experience into a golden national legend. Artists painted luminous scenes of pioneers moving into sunsets, their wagons looking clean and bright against an impossible horizon. Buffalo Bill Cody brought the drama of the frontier to the stage, turning the desperate struggle for survival into a theatrical performance for audiences who had never tasted alkali dust. The smell of the wagon, the weight of the hunger, and the quiet grief of the graves were slowly forgotten, replaced by a story of rugged individualism that served the needs of a growing nation. The myth was more comfortable. In the late 20th century, the Oregon Trail entered the digital memory of a new generation through a computer game that made a punchline out of death by disease. Millions of children sat at screens, clicking through menus of supplies and watching pixelated wagons move across a flat, electronic landscape. They learned the names of the landmarks, but they could not feel the vibration of the unsprung wagon bed or the cold spray of the Snake River. The game was a final abstraction of the journey, a way to play with a history that had once cost 20,000 lives. The pixelated wagons moved in a world without weight, a shadow of the real road. If you go looking today, you can still find the physical signature of the Great Migration written into the very earth of the West. In the soft prairie soil of Wyoming and the high deserts of Idaho, the ruts left by hundreds of thousands of wagon wheels are still visible as deep depressions in the ground. They run parallel and slightly offset, a permanent scar on the landscape that refuses to be healed by the return of the grass. From a satellite high above, these lines look like a skeletal roadmap of a dream, a physical proof that a mass of human beings once moved with a single purpose toward a distant Pacific shore. The earth remembers. The covered wagon remains a symbol of the American identity, representing the restless belief that a better life is always waiting somewhere beyond the next mountain pass. It carries the weight of our highest hopes and our most profound failures, a wooden box that held both the promise of a fresh start and the reality of displacement. The road never truly ends. It only changes shape, moving from the iron-banded wheel to the interstate highway and the digital horizon. As we look at the empty wagon in the museum light, we see a mirror of our own desire to move, to endure, and to reach for a world we can only imagine. The sun is setting now over the Willamette Valley, and the fires in the old camps have long since gone to ash. The wagons are empty, the diaries are closed, and the silence of the Pacific Northwest has swallowed the sounds of the journey. Take a deep breath of the cool, cedar-scented air and let the weight of the day fall away. Much like the heavy cargo left beside the road, you are safe now at the end of the long walk, where the horizon is no longer a promise but a home. Sleep comes softly, like the rain on a canvas bonnet, as the road finally vanishes into the quiet dark of the evening stars. If you found peace in this slow journey through the dust of the Oregon Trail, please quietly like and subscribe to hear more stories from the deep silence of history.